Hello, my name is Gavin. This is Genre Books. There's no specific book I'm talking about today, more talking about an attitude I end up adopting when reading certain types of books. Sometimes I have to think about what I'm reading, how I want to talk about it on BookTube. I will often, when talking about some older books, have to make an excuse or contextualize for awful language, antediluvian opinions, cultural insensitivities, by saying that this book is of its time. But that searing insight might not be enough. I feel a fuller, more proper account ought to be made of it. And what you might want to term this little video as is notes towards an account of awkward literature. And I say awkward because that is the abiding feeling I have reading some of these books. Just awkwardness. I suppose that might come standard to your post-war British psyche. But in a way, it's an odd reaction. This Victober, one of the challenges is an overall month-long challenge to be empire spotting, to be vigilant for signs of the British Empire in the works that we're reading. The wider empire was absolutely central to Victorian Britain. It's all pervasive, as I hope to show when I go through my Victober challenges. I don't feel guilty about the empire. I really didn't have much to do with it, but I can feel awkward. Awkwardness is not limited to just reading about the empire of the country I happen to live in, though. I can certainly feel awkward when I read an old American Western. The language, treatment of other peoples certainly has all the problematic instances that British colonial literature has. Many of these Westerns are colonial literature. Or take a book perhaps like Heart of Darkness. Here we have a Polish writer, Conrad, showing the very poor behaviour of Belgians in the Congo. But he is doubtlessly writing about the British Empire and writing for a British audience. Look at War of the Worlds. Martian invaders, but definitely a poke in the ribs of the British establishment from Mr. Wells. That's all very well and good, and that's why works such as those two endure. There is an implicit and explicit criticism within the pages. So how do I feel about these works? Do I feel chastised? Possibly. There's certainly chastisement going on here. Do I feel guilty? I would, were I personally involved, and I absolutely accept the fact that I will at some point have derived benefit from the fruit of those other countries' labours. Possibly not nearly as much as the benefits I get from the exploitation of people in other countries just by living a modern life. No, I think this awkwardness comes in when the literature is not quite as self-reflexive or self-aware as those two examples I gave. And there is plenty of Western literature. I'm not talking cowboys Western, I'm just talking Western literature, which has blinkered jingoism. Outright bigotry is easy to deal with in literature. Just don't read it. But in many other works, there is, sometimes it's an ignorance, sometimes it's a deluded paternalism, the good intentions even, but clumsy execution. Works of literature that make a point of extolling the innate nobility of peoples and tribes and of peoples of other lands, whilst remaining confident in their own feelings of superiority to make these pronouncements or concessions on or to other people. I could cite Conrad again as an example. A work with a character who has good characteristics, a good character, a good, well-written character, and a good man, and then calling the book N-word of the Narcissus. We like to think that we are much more enlightened now. I very much doubt that we are as enlightened as we would like to be thought. But not reading the works in question is not the pathway to enlightenment. I don't read books that have trigger warnings. I feel I'm big enough and ugly enough to look after myself, but that kind of approach might be the one that needs to be taken. A contextualization note, a warning about the language at the beginning of the book. Not something to put people off, just a general awareness. For myself, I think I'll persevere with the awkwardness. The awkwardness is a bit of a middle ground. I don't feel the guilt of my country's colonial past, but I acknowledge the damage from both the colonial and neo-colonial activities. So far, so self-exculpatory. In the grand scheme of things, it's relatively unimportant. But in the reading of old colonial literature, old empire literature, my empire or anybody else's, or reading new post-colonial literature, it's obviously a much larger issue. I like my post-colonial literature. I know that I haven't read nearly enough. For every Chebe, Rushdie or Marquez I've read, there are 100 Okris, Bulawayo's and Adigas that I have not. But I do think that if we just read post-colonial literature, we're also missing half the story. Just as if a reader was to rigidly stick to Kipling and Haggard. And there is that strange liminal space occupied by the likes of Conrad or E.M. Forster, products of empire, who have the criticism of that empire. It's an altogether more refined awkwardness. Yes, I keep coming back to the word awkward. Awkward is an attitude which I can, as a British man, assume. If you want proof of that, look at any of my previous videos. The British have brought to the world an abysmal idea of superiority in terms of class, gender, ethnicity, creed. Our forebears were willfully ignorant when it came to drawing up borders, separating one country from another. We also, whisper it, occasionally did something that wasn't too bad. But if you want to view the situation in the round, you've got to take account of all of the literatures if you want a proper reading program for literature students. I think, as an aside, that might be a little bit more difficult to do in the last few decades in higher education, where institutions are chasing the tuition fees of international students. I wouldn't want it's not a great advertisement to invite them to the country to study literature and read a bunch of old racists. But I think it's disingenuous to just talk about post-war, post-colonial literature. It's pointless talking about all the posts without knowing what they are post to. And in the fullness of time, even the most enlightened of post-colonial works will offend someone else. In the same way that we may cringe at works from a long time ago, one day we will all be of our time. We are also lucky to have a post-colonial literature, so I don't want to dispense with it. I want it to be integrated. We are lucky to have it. You haven't read many books about the colonization of Tibet from people who live in Tibet recently. Probably. If you have, do let me know. There is a line between something that is of its time and something that is self-evidently racist or sexist. These lines are, to an extent, subjective. I know the difference when I see it, and for me it's the difference between wincing and continuing to read and closing the book. Something which, fortunately, I've only had to do on a few occasions, but I have had to. My lines are going to be in a different place to other readers, and that's okay. If we had absolute rigid borders, we'd be a silly, pale echo, learning nothing from those people in our own imperial past drawing arbitrary borders on maps. Now, I read and will continue to read works from the time of empire, works from colonial literatures, for the same reason I will read any other book. Enjoyment. But all the added context from reading the history around it and reading good colonial literature should enhance that enjoyment and make it easier to sift the good from the bad, but also give you the context enough to pick holes in even what I consider to be the good books. I work for a large company, so every year I have to retake, or do annual attestations and refresh my training in a great many areas. But included in that is that annual training on unconscious bias. A lot of people end up sort of dismissing that, and I think it's a defensive posture. And I think possibly maybe I had that the first time I had that training. But read the examples from the training that you're given if you have something similar. And yes, we do all have it. I think reading these books helps hone the perception of these traits, both within the book and back reflecting to yourself as a reader. I don't think it is helpful, productive to simply shun something. Just confront it. But maybe it's not enough to sort of shrug your shoulders and say, well, it's of its time. And I'm fully aware that I will do that again at some point in the future. I just thought maybe I'll stick a marker in the ground now as I struggle to get the language to express what I feel about it. I ought not to feel guilty about reading those works either. I'm absolutely not proud of the British Empire. I could no more feel proud about the British Empire than I could feel ashamed about the British Empire, because I have that temporal detachment. But it's not an excuse to be ignorant about it, and it's not an excuse to be ambivalent about it either. I'm going to come back to that word again. It's fine, I think, just to feel awkward. I'm sure it's all a lot more complicated than that. But that's why I've said that this is notes towards a feeling of awkwardness. I have more thinking to do about it. But the good news is, to help with that thinking, all I've got to do is read an awful lot more books. So tell me where I'm going wrong, tell me what I should be reading, but don't tell me what I shouldn't be reading. And until next time, bye.